lesson, and this is my first attempt at one of these videos. So I hope it's helpful, and if it is, I'll try and make more of them. Today's lesson is all about the design argument, which is one of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God that we'll look at now at GCSE, but then we cover in a lot more detail in the A-level philosophy course. Tips for today's lesson are to understand William Paley's design argument, apply the Christian view and Christian teachings to the argument with reference to Romans 1 verse 20, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the design argument, including humanist perspectives, as we've been doing in other parts of this unit. So the design argument for the existence of God is sometimes called the teleological argument, and there are a few philosophers that use this argument when arguing the existence of God. One of them is Thomas Aquinas, who we'll study next week, but the most famous philosopher behind the design argument is William Paley. William Paley uses an analogy of a watch when he's putting this argument forward. And he says that if you were taking a walk across a mountain one day and you found a pocket watch on the floor, you would assume that it hadn't always been there. You'd know that it hadn't grown there. It's not a natural thing. So if you opened up the pocket watch and you looked inside and you saw all of the cogs and the wheels and the springs and the nuts and the bolts and the screws, you would assume that it had been put together by someone, and you would realize that it had been put together for the purpose of telling the time. So a watch is clearly designed and put together for the purpose of telling the time, and therefore there must be a watchmaker. There's somebody who's designed it and made it to fulfill that purpose. He says, in the same way then, if we go and we look at some natural elements of the world, so for example, parts of a human body like a human eye, then if we studied them and look at all of the intricate details of them, then we would come to the same conclusion. Things in nature have these clever design features. For example, a peacock's feather that attracts a mate. Also, evidence of order and design in lots of natural things. You may have seen this formula for a spiral in maths, and this appears in lots of places in the natural world. So this spiral can be found in shells, like the example that I'm showing you here. In seed pods, sunflower seeds are arranged in this spiral. And actually, if you look at images of the Milky Way, it's almost that the Milky Way itself follows this design. And William Paley said that wherever you look in nature, you'll find these hints at intricate design. Human eye or a knee or any part of a living thing also shows evidence of being designed and made for a purpose. And therefore, he says, just like with the watch having a designer, there must be a divine watchmaker, and that's what he calls God. So what do you think so far of that argument? Is there evidence of design within nature? Can you think of some examples? And we'll just pause the video here for a moment for you to write some down. Think about examples that I've talked about, but also things that you can think of in the natural world that show an element of order or purpose or design. So some of the examples that I can think of are, I call these dandelion clocks. So when a dandelion has died, the seeds are left there at the head of the flower. And they work in such a way that when a gust of wind comes along, or you can just pick them and blow them, it's really easy for the seeds to be carried away. They all have their own sort of parachute. And that's amazing, because if you look at the pattern that is made from those seeds, and then you look at how well they can be carried in the air in order to be planted somewhere else, it shows what some people would say are elements of design. Another one that I really love is an oyster shell and how pearls are created. So a pearl is created from a substance within the oyster shell called nacre. And nacre is a substance that is there to protect the oyster inside the shell. So if any grit or dirt, bits of rubbish or glass get into the shell somehow, then the oyster wraps those bits of dirt up in this substance called nacre to protect the fleshy part of the oyster. And over time, as all of those bits of dirt and rubbish are wrapped up in this substance, they form the shell. And the solar system itself, we could look at the way that the force of gravity means that the planets orbit the sun, the way that the Earth turns on an axis, how we get days and months and years, how we get seasons. All of that, some people would say, are examples of design, order, and purpose within the universe. So have a go now in your notes at summarizing William Paley's argument. And I've put some things there on the slide to help you with that. So that's another good time to pause the video and make some notes. So what do you imagine the Christian views are towards this argument? Well, hopefully you can see that Christians would probably quite like this argument. Think about what you've learnt in your other Christianity units about the creation story in the Bible. So in the first book of the Bible, the chapter of Genesis, it talks about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And whether Christians take a literal view of Genesis 1 and they say God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, or whether they take a metaphorical view of that story, all Christians believe that God created the world, and they believe that God designed it and purposed it and had a meaning and a reason behind the creation. The source of wisdom has been specified by our specification is Romans 1 verse 20. So it says there, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And what that means is that people are without excuse to believe in God because his nature is being clearly revealed through his creation. So think back to the first lesson of this unit about revelation. We talked about revelation through scripture like the Bible, revelation through religious experiences, revelation through the person of Jesus, and now revelation through creation. And the Christian view of the design argument is that God is the designer and that his nature is revealed through his design. So, what do you think? I'm not going to ask you to write any of this down at the moment, but just think, is this a convincing argument? Do you think that the design argument offers enough evidence that there could be a God that created the universe? Well, I'm going to offer you some alternative explanations, and hopefully you've heard of this person before. This is Charles Darwin. He lived actually not long after William Paley, and apparently he read William Paley's book, and Charles Darwin was actually a Christian as well, and so he believed in God and he believed in the design argument until he started studying evolution. And he is the person that we now attribute the whole theory of evolution to. So one of Charles Darwin's studies was into finches, and he noticed that finches in different parts of the Galapagos Islands, their beaks had developed different shapes depending on which parts of the island they needed to find their food. And so some finches had developed sharper and thinner beaks in order to get insects out of narrow gaps in rocks. And so from this observation, but also lots and lots of others, he put together his theory of adaptation. And his conclusion was that living things had evolved over millions of years through a process of natural selection and adaptation. So you may have heard of survival of the fittest, which means that creatures have to adapt in order that they can survive. And a modern philosopher that kind of also puts forward this argument is Richard Dawkins. And so he takes Charles Darwin's ideas, his theory of evolution, and he uses this as an argument against the existence of God. He says that there is no reason for us to believe in a God, especially a creator God, now that we have the scientific knowledge that we do. So Richard Dawkins, one of his most famous books is called The Blind Watchmaker. And of course, you can see there that that's a direct criticism of William Paley's watchmaker analogy. He's saying that natural selection gives us the appearance of design without actually needing a designer. And so there's no design, there's no designer, and therefore there is no God. So another chance to pause the video and try and summarize the arguments against the design argument from Charles Darwin and Richard Dawkins. And there's some keywords there to help you. Also, in the Q Drive where I've saved all of this work, there's an information sheet from Humanists UK, and that summarises their view on the design argument and why they believe we can find beauty and purpose in the world without needing to believe in God. And now's your chance to write down what you think. Remember, if we're doing a 12-mark question, you need to be able to introduce the topic with all of the keywords and the context. You need to be able to give arguments on both sides. You also need to give your opinion. So I'd like you to write in your notes, please, a short paragraph. Do you think the design argument is convincing? Does it give you reason to believe that there may be a God? Is it more or less convincing than some of the other arguments that we've looked at, like religious experience or revelation? And I hope you found this video useful. Hopefully that's helped you to understand this argument a little bit better. And you've got lots of other things to look at as well. I photocopied pages from the book and that Humanists UK worksheet as well. Don't forget to email if you have any questions, and hopefully see you soon.